Okay, so we're in the Ritz Bar, and a place you know very well.
Yes, 25 years manager.
Okay.
Yeah.
And before we get on to the Ritz Bar, we'll go back first of all to your own family.
Yes.
So tell us about who your grandparents were on both sides.
Yeah, my grandparents were, my father's was a master baker in Waterford, in Patrick Street in Waterford, Patrick Whittle. And that's where my dad lived at the time of the ambush there. Now, my mother's parents had a hotel, the Bula Bawn, here in Tramore. But at that time it was known as Troy's Hotel. And that's where she was married from, Troy's Hotel. You've heard of the Bula Bawn, yeah.
And how did they meet, your grandparents?
It would have been after the Troubles, like, and that. They were married in 1927, I think it was. They met and they were married. The parents her father didn't approve, like, she was beneath his daughter, his only daughter. Yes, he wasn't good enough, but anyway, they married anyway, and they had seven children.
But this obviously was a love then.
The what?
It was a love story.
Oh, it was a love story. It was like my own. It was a love story.
And then, obviously, you mentioned the Pickerstown ambush.
Yes.
And we're going to talk about that. But before we get on to that, let's just talk about your own childhood.
My own childhood, Tramore was a wonderful place to grow up in. It was magic. When I say it was magic, we didn't have money. Nobody had money, but it didn't matter. You could enjoy yourself down on the beach, over at the cove, out at the Metalman and that. The thing about, you went down around, which you've all heard of, and the minute you got to the top of Train Hill, you could hear the sounds of down around. The music would be blaring from loudspeakers. There was no jukeboxes. And the tunes would be cruising down the river, and if you knew Susie like I knew Susie, all the old songs, they'd be played. And there was a great atmosphere. And when you went down towards the Deluxe, the first person you'd meet then was blind Lar Keown. He would be sitting on a box playing his accordion. And then each arcade had their own site. You had Dave Barry on one side, Wilf Dooley on the other, Wilf's grandfather would be on the other side. Then you had the Atlantic Ballroom. And I remember years ago there was a theatre used to come to Tramore every summer. They used to put on wonderful plays. The name was Courtney's. I've never heard of them since, but they did wonderful, the Crappie Boy and all those things. The Atlantic, we had wonderful bands. Philmurtha played every summer with Joe Loss. All the big time bands used to come to Tramore. And it was a great place to live.
And the other way, Tramore was quite a middle class place, right? In lots of ways. Did they look down their noses at the fairground people?
No, we thought they were lovely. We thought they were glamorous. We thought because they had caravans, and even the Gypsy Rose, we had a fortune teller. We thought she was very glamorous. She had a little caravan there. I think what really made the arcades in Tramore was when, you've heard of Pongo, have you? Yeah. Pongo was the original bingo. And that was the start of making the arcades, because people used to queue up to get a seat to play their Pongo. Then it wasn't only slot machines. There was lots of various kind of things you put a penny in, and horses would be racing, and then you had the spin the wheel. Also, in one of the arcades, they had a blind man. His name was Martin O'Sullivan from Waterford, and he used to have a piano. They provided him with a piano in the arcade, and he would be over in the corner playing, and people would sing. But there's one thing I'm just remembering now about one of the best nights of the year was New Year's Eve night. There was a couple that lived up in Peter Street in Tramore, Ca Butler and Bill Keefe. And at about 11:30 of a New Year's Eve night, they'd out with the accordions, and we'd be like all following them. We did every street in Tramore. You'd have about 30 or 40 people following them, and they did every street, and it finished up in the Grand Hotel Square, where you proceeded to have a dance. And I mean, I am talking about you wouldn't have a heel on your shoe by the time. There weren't roads then. And there was always a posh do on in the Grand Hotel that night. An evening dress ball. And I remember they used to be looking out the window as much as to say, looking at the riffraff. But it was a wonderful place to grow up.
And just go back to the amusements then, the blind guy who played the piano.
Yeah, he was from Waterford.
Yeah, people would just sing along with it.
Oh, just people just group around him, and he'd know your voice. If you asked him to play a certain song, and he'd say, Linda. Joan Phelan, as Kieran will know, she'd say, play Linda, and he'd say, Joan, I will if you sing it. And that was the way it was. Now the boys were fairly good at flicking the slot machines. They had a way of they could put the finger in and give it a little. There was another thing we had to do this come the end of August. Everyone had to go and pick blackberries. There was no houses all up this way, and this was to get money for your books. So you'd have your sweet gallon and you'd go off and you'd pick blackberries. But on the way down, we was come to this, I can still see it, a horse trough. I think it's still up on the top of Galway's Hill. I'd say that's the same one. And we used to scoop about 2 fists of water in on top of the blackberries to give them a bit of weight. And I have a feeling that we'd go down to Hughie Doherty to sell the blackberries. And I'd say he knew. Now, we wouldn't overdo it, just a couple of little to give it. But we were talking about names in Main Street. There was one man, and his name was Well Held. And that's what he was known as, Well Held. And the reason he was called Well Held was there was no machines for cutting butter and cheese and ham. It all came in big blocks. And he'd be cutting it with the knife. And he'd always put out his hand like that, and he'd say, Well Held. And that's how he got his name. There was another man, and he got summoned. He lived in, no names, he lived in Main Street, and it was discovered he was putting stones in the jam. This was after the war, to give them weight. He was duly summoned, so he was. And then we had another man down on Queen Street, and his name was Snackaham, because, like that again, he liked using the knife to cut the ham. And he'd say, and would your mommy like a snack of ham? And I mean, you couldn't afford snack of ham, so he got the name Snack of Ham.
And what was the man with the stones and the jam? What was his nickname?
I know I won't give his name
Okay.
because there's family are still.
And another name we've heard is the Blue Lookout.
The Blue Lookout, the idea of the Blue Lookout was when I worked in the Seaview, and you wouldn't just go and open the door because the guards would be on duty. So what you did is you went out and you looked at the door and you stood at the door and you looked up and you looked down and if all was clear you'd say, all clear, and that was it. So I think that's why it was called the Blue Lookout.
So it was a good place for...
All pubs were.
Yeah, the opening hours were terrible, weren't
They were very strict. They were unreasonable. You could, that has all changed now. Like,
so when the pub should be empty, it was full.
they'd be busier than the night from midnight. I can remember being here and we used to get an awful lot of dubs, as we used to call them, and they were lovely people. We had a singing lounge in there, and they used to come to the caravan site park, which was just up the road. And there was two of the husbands came in to me one day, and they said, "We're off tonight. The women are letting us out tonight. Can you tell us where would we find a lock-in?" You know what a lock-in is, yeah. So I just told them where to go, and I said, just tell them, Breda, you'll know where it was. Breda said, "You're okay." The next evening at about 7 o'clock, I could only describe them as two walking corpses came in the door. And I said, "Well, how did you get on?" "Oh, Jesus, we got in, but you never told us how to get out of it." They couldn't get anyone to let them out. They were there till something like 4 or 5 in the morning. Every time they went to try and get out, they couldn't. They were good days now.
So when you were small then, where did you go to school?
I went to school here in Tramore, and then I went to the presentation in Waterford. I went in on the train. You'd get a monthly ticket.
And generally, some girls that went into Waterford went to the Earthling, then some went to the presentation.
Mm-hmm.
And was that family differences, or what was that? Why did you go to one?
Well, the Earthling was considered grand. You know, presentation would be just... and don't forget that long ago your families either want nuns or priests in the family. We had three non-runners. They tried to make a nun out of me, and my brothers, they tried to make priests, but 3 of them went and 3 failed. So now...
So the 3 of them went off to become priests?
They did. One went to Freshford. You've heard of Freshford, yeah, he went there. And another boy went up to Oma. And he was there for something like 8 or 9 years and came out then. And another lad went to Italy. And he came home. The thing was to have a nun or a priest in the family.
It's classic.
Isn't it? Yeah.
That was normal, wasn't it?
That was normal. That was the normal, yeah. It was kind of a prestige thing, yeah.
And sorry, what did your father and mother do? What were they?
Well, Dad was a baker by trade. That's what he was. But then after the trouble, he couldn't get a pension. There was no pensions after the troubles. And he became a commercial traveller, which wasn't a great pay. You only got paid what you sold. But he wrote 2 books. He wrote a lot of plays. He was right for the Waterford News and the Munster Express, and that'd bring in money. He'd do an article each week for there. Actually, if you Google it, you'll see Nicholas Whittle, and he had a play also on Radio Éireann. There was well on that. But he wrote The Gentle County, and he wrote Waterford Remembers, which is, both are very hard to get. You can't get them.
And was your mother full-time at home?
Yeah, mum didn't work. She was full-time. Well, we had 7 children, yeah. We had a poor creature working for us with a hard ticket. And I don't know what wages she must have got, about 2 shillings a week. You know, but then nobody had money.
And then, you said it was a great place to grow up. So
You could spend all day down the beach. When I got married and I had my children then, we headed off to the beach until I got full-time work. Now, I became a widow when I was 32. I had 3 children. The eldest was 5 and the youngest was 3 months. So people say to me, how did you manage? You know, and my answer to that is, with the help of friends and neighbours. They were fantastic. They minded the children when I went to work in the night time. That's how I learned the bar trade. I just put the kids to bed, 8 o'clock, 8:30, and a neighbour would come in then and stay until I came home. They were wonderful people.
that's amazing.
Yeah, but don't forget, there was only that was 1969 when Tommy died. I think there was only about 3,000 was the population, would it be? Yeah?
Of Tramore.
Yeah, just over anything between 3 and 4. So everybody knew each other. And if you had trouble, they were there in the morning. They were absolutely, just like you'd come home and there'd be you'd leave a note on the door, key under the mat. You all heard. That was quite common to say the key was under the mat.
And would you remember like the bailing booths or
The which?
the bailing huts and all that kind of stuff down on the beach and all that? You know, where people got changed for
Oh, yeah. You see, we couldn't go swimming together. I could go with my mother into the ladies' slip. And the boys had to go down to the end of the prom with Daddy, with the father. Now, my father would get a bed box. You could never, to be on site, you wouldn't see them undress. Anyway, they were there, and then we'd meet up again afterwards. But we had, Mam Dahl was in charge of the ladies' slip. And if by chance a man happened to come down that slip, by God, he got it. He got his comeuppance. So she'd clear him off. A man couldn't go down there. And that was her name. She was famous, Mam Dahl.
And she looked after all the women.
She had the bathing boxes, and she would tell us if the tide was bad, she'd hunt you home, go home. Like our saying, there's the tide.
And would you? When did you start working when you were still in school?
I was working when I was 13. And when I say I was working, it was during the summer. There was always plenty work for. That's one thing in Tramore. There was always summer work. The boys used to get jobs down on the donkey rides. Roddy Crane had about 8 or 9 donkeys, and you get 6 a week. And there'd be a queue for those jobs. And I must say, also the arcade people were very good to give the young lads jobs.
And what was your job?
My job, I was serving ice cream. Now, it wasn't, there was no block of ice cream. It was a metal container. And you had this metal, you were shown how to use it. A metal, have you ever seen it?
At school?
No. It had a handle, and you put one wafer flat, and then you got a scoop of the ice cream, and you fill the container. It was only square, and you levelled it off, and then you got another wafer and you put it on top, depending on it was a tuppenny ice cream or a threepenny ice cream. And then you'd press the little button and the wafer came up. And that's how you got your ice cream. There was no blocks. Same with butter. There was a lot of horses in Tramore. Everything was delivered. The bread was delivered by pony and cart. O'Brien's down in... Did you know that? All the goods came on the train from Waterford to the railway here, and Toddy Murphy and Mr. Brown, they took the parcels and delivered them around Tramore. The coalman was the same horse, so there used to be a battle. There used to be a battle with the shovel and the fire shovel to go and collect the manure. I'll have to mention one man, and that is, he was a lovely man. Teddy Kennedy. He was well known in Tramore and loved. But he used to be very busy with his pony and cart, because he was great to bring stuff to the dump. You had to bring it to the dump. And his horse's name was Dolly. He was absolutely fantastic. Lovely fella, Teddy Kennedy. But you'd have to queue up to get Teddy. I suppose he used to only get about 2 shillings. He worked for the Seaview. He was permanent in the Seaview. When I say permanent, every Monday morning he went to Seaview. Everything had to be brought to the dump.
And your ice cream place, was that down around?
The which?
The ice cream place that you worked at?
Oh yeah, it was the Railway Cafe. It was owned by Charlie Forty. He came to Ireland. He was Italian, and he later bought the Lido and the Lido in Waterford. And then I went. There was another place that sold ice cream. It was the OK. I think a lot of people knew where the OK was. There again, the ice cream was made in a little container, wafer, fill it with ice cream. But I think I was reprimanded because I gave a friend a bigger ice cream for. I was going to be sacked, so I was. The manageress said, "You gave your friend a bigger ice cream." So I think that was the end of my career.
They were strict.
Oh, they were fairly strict. All right, the jobs were hard to get to.
And you were going in and out of the train to Waterford. What was your memory of the train?
The train. Well, we had a monthly ticket when I was. We used to go to the Olympic skating rink every Tuesday. We'd go in on the train. And the fellas were devils, because as soon as the train would leave the station below, they just go from carriage to carriage on the outside. It was no bother to them, you know.
That was how they get to one carriage to the next carriage.
Yeah, if the lack was in next door, yeah, you'd go from one carriage to the other. It was just devilment.
It's a bit like a cowboy film, really.
Yeah.
And that was your main reason to go into Tramore socially, was the skating?
Yeah, but we were happy enough in Tramore. We had a skating rink here in Tramore then, in the Silver Slipper, during Lent. There used to be no dancing. There was no dancing during Lent. It was sinful. So yeah, it became a skating rink.
Were you good at skating?
I was, yeah. I was on the hockey team, so I was. Unfortunately, they put me on goal, and I was nearly killed one night when I saw them all coming towards me. Tramore were beaten, actually. Tessie Power, she was our lady
And so where did boys and girls meet in Tramore?
Oh no, we could meet. It was easy meeting, all right. So they were, except my brothers were very strict. They used to tell father if they saw me off and talking to. I thought I'd never get married because my father would chase every fella that came to the door, being the only girl.
So he was very protective.
Oh, he was, yeah, very, he was very strict. He was very old, he was a very strict man, yeah. I must say he loved Ireland. He loved Ireland.
And your husband, how did you meet him?
I met Tommy a blind date down in the X Square. That was Ragnall Road now. And someone set us up. He was an engineer at sea, and he was home from Japan, and I met him, and it was love at first sight.
Good.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we only had about 6 years, and he died, a massive brain hemorrhage, and he died. Yeah, but
that must have been really difficult.
It was, but as I say, my fear was, and what kept me going was, you had an awful fear along go that if you didn't look after your children, they'd be taken off you. I don't know why I got that, but that was true. Like, they'd be sent to Dungarvan or something. So I think that made me work all the harder to keep them together. And thanks be to God, I reared one in Australia now, and 2 of them is living here in Tramore. 1 girl and 2 boys.
And then working in the pub business, what was that like for you as a woman? Did you find it difficult?
No, they had the greatest respect for me. And the super said to Benny went down, that's the owner of the time, went downtown to him one night, and he said, look, for God's sake, will you go up and give Breda a hand to clear the place? I mean, the cars would be up Love Lane at that time, like, it was so busy. And he said, Matt Sill said, I can assure you Breda's well able to clear the place. I got on well with the youngsters. And then being so small, I'd be trying to clear the place, and they'd put me standing up on a stool. And I'd be shouting, come on lads, come on, please. Guards were very strict now. There was a few of them now that weren't that nice. To me.
John,
Yeah.
And you did it for 20 years, you said?
25.
25.
Exactly the day I gave up, the day I was 65. I said, that's it, I'm finished. And they rang about 4 nights later and said, please, will you come down? People are out. In the old days, the place used to be packed. And my daughter said, no, you're not going down. She said, I'll go down and give him a hand. And she was here then for 8 years. She stayed with until John took over. So we were in it for a long time.
And did you notice any changes over those 25 years?
Oh gosh, yes, completely different. No, I made wonderful friends, and I've no regrets about it. Because I was working in the golf club when I got the offer of coming here. And I mean, that was a good pensionable job up there, as you can imagine. And I wondered once or twice, did I make the right decision? But I did, I made the right decision, because the friends that I made here in the Ritz, I still have them today. They were absolutely fantastic.
And then what about drinking habits? Did you notice that changing?
Yes, because drink and drive has a big... And in the old days, as I was just saying to Kieran, you had the paddies coming over. Don't mind me saying the paddies, but all the lads that, including my brothers, that had to go to England for work. When they came home, they used to have plenty of money. They'd have loads of money. So they'd come home for a fortnight and they'd be buying for the boys, and they were different times. You wouldn't see anyone drinking in the daytime now. They just...
So people would be on the tear for a couple of weeks.
Oh, they'd be singing here at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You know, and I'd drive them home. There was one great character, what was his name? Michelin O'Sullivan. He was the grave digger out in Fenner. But he'd overdo it. When I'd say he'd entertain people, but then he didn't know when to stop, and visitors loved him. And that was his name, Michelin O'Sullivan. And he was like a leprechaun. But the guards brought him out, gave him a lift just to get rid of him out to Fenner one night, or one day. And by the time they came back in Tramore, they passed him, go down Main Street. He would have to get in the lift from someone else. He was a great character. They were great characters. They're not making him like that now anymore.
Speaking of characters, can you remember characters from way back when you were young, like?
Oh gosh, I would. I would remember a lot of them. You had Teddy Shanahan, and you had, no disrespect to them, but they were just. Paddy Burns, the fisherman, he was a lovely man. He used to have a little Honda. We all knew Paddy and the Honda. It's hard to remember everything.
Yeah, and I suppose to go back to your family story, because it's a big story in relation to the ambush.
Mm-hmm.
So, when did you become aware of that story?
I didn't realise. I don't know what age it was when I realised that we were different. Our family was different. We used to have people who would be on the run. Now, we thought it was great having all these. A fellow might be there for 3 days, and I didn't know he'd be on the run. Like, you know, or like we were safe house, obviously. And another thing that's stuck in my mind is of a Saturday, maybe once a month. My brother, I was about 11 or 12, and he was 7. He remembers that we talked about it during the week. And we'd have to go into Waterford, and we'd be given an envelope, and I could find both of these houses today. One of them was opposite Good Shepherd's. There's where elderly people lived. And her name was Nanny D. Never forgot the name. That's 70 years ago. Her name was Nanny D. And we went there, and I know we gave her the envelope. I just knew what I had to do, and then the two of us walked from there down to the back of Shaw's. What's the name of the church there?
St. Patrick's.
St. Patrick's. There was another group of houses there where ladies lived there, and her name was Mrs. Dower. Remember the two names, Mrs. Dower and Nanny D, and we had an envelope for her as well. And it was only years later I found out what it was it was a £0.50. Their sons were in prison. And the business people and the sympathisers used to put the money together to help them. And I mean, £0.50 probably was a lot at that time. That's when I kind of knew. And there was only one time I was a bit nervous, and that was the time of the bee specials. Now, it meant nothing to me, but I know they were calling to question my father. And we were told to stay in the kitchen. We weren't to come out of the kitchen until these men were gone. They were the only two things I remembered about.
I mean, your dad was an old IRA.
Oh, he was, yeah. I mean, there was great men in Tramore. Tommy Brennan. I was hoping Sean Brennan had.
Yeah. And come here, did he continue involvement right up into the modern day?
No, when as I say, he spent four hours crawling with the 3 bullets in him.
Oh, tell us the story. Yeah.
Well, the story was that when the shooting started, he was at the shrine, and he was lying down with one of his Michael Wiley and Mikey McGrath, and next thing he felt something in his neck. He didn't realise it was a bullet, but anyway, next thing everything went chaotic. Then shouting and shooting and everything. So then he got a second bullet in his spine, I think it was, near his spine. And he got a third one. And he was lying on the ground, and there was a British soldier beside him who had been shot. So he said he stayed still. He kept his eyes closed. And one of the British soldiers came up and said, "I think he's done for." That was my father. And he said, "Oh, he might be only shaman," he said. So he gave him a kick and he turned him over. So he didn't make a sound. He said he just didn't make a sound. Anyway, the next thing was one of the IRA men, he thinks this was Mikey McGrath, shouted something, "You come on the rebels" or something, and drew away the soldiers, and they followed him, and actually they caught him and gave him an awful death. They beat him to death, that chap. But they moved away from where Daddy was. So he realised he was on his own then with Michael Wiley. So he turned around and crawled over to the ditch and eventually got over the ditch and down into the field, which is there today. And he just crawled all night until he got to a cousin of his about down near Dunmore. 3 houses wouldn't help him. I suppose you can't blame them. They didn't know what was happening. And then they were, after that then, a doctor came, Dr. Purcell came the next day from Waterford and removed 2 of the bullets and kind of bandaged himself and Wiley up. And then they were taken to the mental hospital. They had great friends there, connections with there. And they were there for 10 days, I think, in the mental hospital. And their wounds were dressed and that. And after that then they were going from safe house to safe house. And eventually they went up to Portnaskilly, up in Portlaw. And when he was better then, he travelled over to... They thought the best thing for him to do was to get out of the country, was to get him to England. So he went over on the St. Patrick's Day, and a telegram arrived in Waterford to the priest in Waterford. Shamrock arrived safely. So that was he had arrived. So he was in England then, going from Billy to Jack and safe house, until July. And he came home then in July. The treaty was signed, I think, in July. And his first public appearance, really a public appearance, there was a concert on in the Theatre Royal. And he had a good singing voice, my father. And they had a concert on to raise funds. And his name wasn't on the list, but the MC said, and the next man that sings is the man who was and is. And they pushed Daddy out onto the stage. And he said the place just erupted. And he sang the Battle Hymn and Donna LeBou. He sang those two songs. And that was his first public appearance.
He had a good voice.
Oh, he had a lovely voice, yeah. He had a very good voice.
And then, after that then, was
well, there were the treaty was signed then, and people say in his statement, which I have at home, people have said they followed his coffin full of stones, but he says no, he doesn't go along with that. He said that the IRA decided to declare him dead, that he'd have some chance. So they officially declared him dead. His parents closed down the business for the day or the couple of days, and but there was no. They tried several graves, newly dug graves, looking for him, but they never did find him.
So it was a decoy, basically.
It was, yeah. It was better for him to do that, yeah. But people claim they walked behind the coffin. He doesn't.
Was he anti-treaty or was he?
Now that I wouldn't know about that now.
Okay.
I know the treaty. I remember looking at was sometime sometime in July. I think the treaty was signed. Yeah.
And did he ever talk much about it? That whole time.
We had lots of. When I say famous people, we know now they were famous people. Just come. Maud Ghana McBride was one. Mrs. Calbrewer came and stayed with us. Brian O'Higgins, so he had great connections like that. And but I think with children it just goes over your head.
And was he always a baker then?
Oh yeah, he was a baker. He was a wonderful baker. Well, his father was a master baker, whatever that was, I don't know. But I remember they had a big, huge gold frame and certificate.
And was he always working in Waterford City?
Yeah, until he came to Tramore then, and he worked from. He travelled.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he travelled then.
Yeah, okay. And would he ever do any cooking at home then?
The only thing he made, and it was absolutely beautiful, was shortbread. He made it every Christmas.
And did you ever get any of the skills passed on to you?
No, not really. It's I hadn't time.
Too busy.
It was easier to buy it.
And okay, so just trying to think now, what are a few other memories of growing up? What about the role of women back then?
The women were the bosses, definitely, I think. They had it hard. I know the poor people that worked for us, I know she had it tough, with her son and her husband. They always had to produce the large bottle, as the fella said. But I definitely think the women were the earners in the families.
Kept the whole thing going.
Yeah, that's it exactly. They were always able to manage. That's the word. We had a wonderful soup kitchen here in Tramore. It was fantastic. It was run by the ladies. When I say the ladies of Tramore, the solicitors' wives and the doctors' wives and everything. And my God, this soup, you could trot a mouse on it. It was beautiful. It was down a Main Street. And you could go in with your can and you could buy threepence worth of soup. And they went to the school once a week with big turns supposed to be for the poor children. We were first in the queue, so we were Joe Barrow myself. No, the soup kitchen was good.
And were you conscious of the fact that you were kind of poor?
That we were.
That you were poorer than a lot of these people?
No, it didn't bother us. We were never, can't explain it. Like, you must remember, it's after the war. If you got bread and margarine, you were lucky, like, you know, and cocoa. I think we were all reared on cocoa. And I think I was married before I had my first bit of roast dinner.
But you weren't conscious of it growing up as a child?
No. I mean, there was the tailors here. There was the two tailors here in Tramore, and they could work magic. If they got a woman's coat, they could reverse it, turn it into a boy's coat. And dear, you say to your brother, "Now look at the girl's coat you have on you." The women always managed. They helped each other.
And then within Tramore, the other way there was different kind of, like you had the Protestant, big houses.
Yeah.
But you also had the Catholic big houses as well. I mean, I know there was probably more.
Yeah, but they were always very nice. The dupes now and the Galways down in, I always found them very nice. And we used to buy their flowers. They'd sell their flowers in the garden now and things like that, you know.
But you wouldn't mix socially?
Oh, socially, no. You were, they were a breed all of themselves. Like they kept to themselves, you know.
And the church, I suppose, the Catholic Church, which you were a part of, obviously, but they were very strict in that time, weren't they?
They were too strict, you know. And I mean, the nuns were terrible, dreadful. And I always found with the nuns, they always picked on the children that had to walk 3 miles. I won't say poorer, they couldn't have been poorer than us, but anyway, that had to walk 3 miles to school. If they were a few minutes late or 5 minutes late, they got the leather, you know, in their hands. They just seemed to pick on the poorer people. Don't know why, it was just something they had.
And then, would you, like, when you said they were too strict, I mean, you mentioned later on about, we say Lent, all the dances were stopped and all that kind of stuff. What other things would you remember from that time that was kind of very strange now when you look back at it?
I tell you, it's gone too much probably gone too much the other way. But we had the best of it. We had, I often say it to people, people my age group, when I meet them up at the supermarket and we're talking about long ago, I'd say, we had the best of it. We had a wonderful life.
And sorry, did you mention about going to the dances here in Tramore? Did you mention that?
Oh, I did, yeah. We go to the 2 sessions. There was 2 sessions of a Sunday night. One started, I think, 9 to midnight, and then midnight to 3. And it was nothing for us to hide our shoes under the bushes, come home and wait till Mum and Dad were in bed, and then sneak out and get the second pair of shoes and off down the... But it was... You weren't afraid then. There was no fear. You could come up the road and 3 o'clock in the morning. There was no fear there.
And then what about race week? Did you talk about that?
Race week. Well, we couldn't afford to go to the races. So the boys would go up during the day, and they'd find a spot where there was a weakness in the sheeting, and they'd bend back the sheeting, and that'd be grand to be ready for the race day then. And the thing about it is, one fellow would go in and he put his ear to the ground to see could he hear the horses come. It's a wonder he wasn't killed. Anyway, and if it was all clear then, we'd all run like rabbits across the road.
And in under the shed?
In the hole. It was called the hole. Where's the hole? Go around the back.
So you'd be running across the actual the race track?
Oh yeah, we'd have to, sure. But we'd make sure the horses were gone.
Yeah.
Except sometimes there'd be one poor different coming up there. Then you were in trouble. But I know race week was great. When I said the atmosphere, the 15th of August was my biggest day here. I'd have to be here to have the door open by 10 o'clock. And the first of the farmers had come in, and they're all dressed up in their suits. The suit came out on the 15th of August. Well, it was well known as Farmers' Day. They all came to Tramore. And you had down around, as they'd say, you'd have the 3-card trick. You'd have the strongman. You often saw the strongman, did you?
Tell us, what was it?
The strongman would be on the prom. He wouldn't be there. He'd be there race week, and he'd have some kind of canvas or something like that, and it'd have broken glass on it, broken bottles on it. That's honestly. And the thing was, he'd lie on that, and there'd be a stone then put on it. And someone would be called from the audience. It wouldn't be a hammer now, it'd be a mallet, but to be a fair old big size mallet, and he'd give it a belt, that. And then there'd be great cheers then when your man would stand up, and there'd be no cuts. And he was known as the strong man. And you had the 3-card trick would be there, and they'd be watching the police. If a policeman came, they'd be gone like that, like a shot. There was lots of things going on at that time.
And you know, earlier on you mentioned the woman, Gypsy Rose, whatever.
Yes.
Did you know any of the girls ever went to her?
I know she was accepted as one of us.
Yes, presumably some people would believe in that.
Oh, I know what you mean. Oh, they love going to her. They just queue up going to her. Especially when we had soldiers here. They'd have had money then to go and visit Rose. But she lived I think she only died a couple of years ago. She lived down in Riverstown. And she was a lovely person.
And did anyone ever swear that she was true, that she could tell?
Nah. Would you?
Okay, so she
just read your palm, I suppose, and she probably...
Wants to hear as well.
Yeah, that's it. They'll all tell you the same thing. Your children will wear a uniform. Well, they're bound to wear a uniform. That was one of the ones, uniform. And you'd fall in love with a lovely fella.
Please God.
Yeah.
And tell me, do you know the way, in the old days, do you know the way people would have superstitions?
Mm-hmm.
Would you remember any of those old superstitions that people?
You'd have respect for him. You know, we'd always put out our purse on St. Bridget's night, and a piece of cloth, they called it, a rag they called it. It was supposed to be a cure for a headache. I don't know whether it was or not. You said, well, it was so, in 1969, when I became a widow, I had to wear black for 6 months, and I couldn't put on a radio. It was that strict.
And you know, earlier on we were looking at a photograph, and you mentioned about the Shawleys.
Oh, the Shawleys, yeah, they were in Waterford even recently. Like when I say 10, 15 years ago, you'd see them selling the fish opposite Dunn's, you know, in that corner there. I'd say they were grand and comfortable, grand and warm. But one thing I must often thought of and envied, my mother was very charitable, and we used to visit lots of the 24s we call them. They're lovely now up by the school. They were so clean. The little grate was always gleaming. You know, everything was highly polished. And you wondered how they managed. There was a lady who was called to us. We were always called, it was a gentleman or a lady, always at the door. You couldn't say a woman or a man. But we had this, Bridgie Mum was her name. I won't tell you what we called her, but anyway, Bridgie Mum used to come. And she had one of these shawls. She'd come about once a week, and she'd say, I wonder, would your mother have a pinch of tea? Asked her she wouldn't, where would she get it? She'd say. And the other thing she used to look for was, have you ever heard of a float? She was always looking for a float. A float was a little lamp, a little dish with oil in it. And the float was on top, a little wick that you could light in front of the Sacred Heart. And Bridgie would say, would your mother have a float? I said, she wouldn't, where would she get it? She'd ask you, and she'd give you the answer at the same time. And we had another man, Martin, God help him, he used to come for the paper. But he always got yesterday's paper. He'd come the day after, and he was given, Daddy'd always keep the paper for him. And poor Martin was as black as the ace of spades, because the only heat they had was turf. And he said he couldn't wash his hair because you get pneumonia. So his poor head just be black with soot. God, they were.
And obviously your parents were quite generous to you.
They were very, very, very kind. Very. In the night time, the newsboys used to come into our house. They'd have to come out on the train from Waterford to deliver the whatever newspaper, the News and Star, the Waterford News or whatever. There'd be maybe three of them. But you'd come into our kitchen, and the young fellas would be there having tea, having cocoa, bread and cocoa. Like, you know, that they were kind. Everyone was kind. You shared what you had.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think, did we get everything there was? Okay, can say we are now.
Yeah.
We're going to come over with the camera and look over your shoulder.
Yeah.
And you just